Colonel Frederick Lancaster learned this too late, when his body was already rotting from within, when his skin turned the color of rotting flesh, when he begged for water but couldn't swallow. Doctors called it a mysterious wasting disease. But one person knew the truth, the young woman who brought him his meals every morning, who watched him deteriorate with eyes that showed no mercy. Her name was Binta, and she counted the days since that horrible night when Lancaster handed her over as property to his 5 guests, 5 men, an endless night of horror. But Binta didn't scream for mercy. She planned for justice. And in the Louisiana plantation homes of the 1840s, justice came slowly, mixed with breakfast, with evening soup, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. This is the story of the young slave girl who turned a monster's table into her own tomb. This is just the first part, and what comes next is even darker. And if you believe that time does not erase justice, click on the registration button now and come with me. The gas lamps flickered in Lancaster Hall's dining room, casting dancing shadows across the faces of men who had traveled from as far as Charleston and Savannah. Colonel Frederick Lancaster stood at the head of his mahogany table, a crystal glass of Kentucky bourbon raised high, his mutton chops freshly trimmed for the occasion. Outside, the Louisiana night pressed hot and thick against the mansion's tall windows, carrying the scent of magnolias and something darker, the smoke from the quarters where 300 souls lived in conditions these men would never see. "Gentlemen," Lancaster announced, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, "tonight we celebrate not just profit but prosperity. The Lancaster plantation has exceeded all projections. My cotton yields are the envy of 3 states." The 5 men around the table raised their glasses. Judge Milton Graves from New Orleans, banker Thomas Ashworth from Natchez, plantation owners Robert Dalton and William Pierce from neighboring parishes, and Lancaster's cousin, merchant captain James Lancaster, newly arrived from his shipping routes. Binta stood in the corner, her posture perfect as she'd been taught, her eyes downcast. At 17, she had been in Lancaster's house for 3 years, taken from the fields when the colonel's wife noticed her unusual beauty. High cheekbones, skin like polished walnut, eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds. Mrs. Lancaster had died 2 years ago from yellow fever. Now no one stood between the colonel and his impulses. "I have a special gift for you this evening," Lancaster continued, his words beginning to slur. "Entertainment befitting men of our stature. Before continuing, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't just history, it's a story that was erased, whispered about in quarters, and forgotten by time. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that don't get told in textbooks, hit that like button and subscribe. There are hundreds of these tales waiting." Binta felt the weight of their stares before she understood what was happening. Lancaster's hand gestured toward her, and the room's temperature seemed to drop despite the sweltering heat. "Gentlemen, I present to you an unspoiled treasure," Lancaster said, and the words made Binta's stomach turn to ice. She had heard whispers, stories from other house servants about what happened when men like these gathered, stories about girls who went into rooms and came out different, broken, with eyes that looked through you instead of at you. "Frederick, you're too generous," Judge Graves said, but his eyes were already calculating, hungry. The next hours dissolved into a nightmare that Binta would never fully remember and never fully forget. 5 men, 5 separate horrors. The colonel's guest rooms with their expensive wallpaper and imported furniture became chambers of violence. She tried to disappear into herself, to become nothing, to float away from her own body, but she couldn't. Every moment burned itself into her memory, not the details, which her mind mercifully blurred, but the faces. Oh, she would never forget the faces. Judge Graves, who lectured about morality from the bench, banker Ashworth, who funded churches, the plantation owners who spoke of Christian duty, Captain Lancaster, who smiled the entire time, and finally, Colonel Lancaster himself, who took what he called first rites at dawn when the others had finished. When it was over, when the sun was rising pink and gold over the sugarcane fields, Binta was returned to the servants' quarters. The other women knew. They always knew. Old Ruth, who had survived 40 years of this hell, helped her into the bath they'd prepared, water heated over fires they'd kept burning all night. "Child," Ruth whispered, washing blood from Binta's legs, with hands that trembled with rage and sorrow. "You got two choices now. You can die inside, or you can live for revenge." Binta said nothing. Her throat was raw from screaming that no one had answered, but somewhere in the ruins of that night, something crystallized. Not death, not surrender. Revenge. "I know plants," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible. "My grandmother was a healer in the old country, taught me things before they took her, things that can help, things that can hurt." Binta met the old woman's eyes, and Ruth saw something there that made her nod slowly. "Good," Ruth said. "Good. Then we begin tomorrow. But slow, child. Slow and steady. Justice takes time when you got no power but patience." The next morning, Colonel Lancaster announced at breakfast that Binta would now serve as his personal attendant. She would bring his meals, draw his baths, attend to his every need. He smiled when he said it, a smile that promised this nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. But Binta smiled back, a small smile, the first smile of a very long game. Comment below. Revenge has a price. If you think Binta is right in planning this revenge, I want to know if you would have the same courage. Ruth's lessons began in the darkest hours before dawn, when even the overseers slept off their whiskey. The old woman's cabin was the smallest in the quarters, tucked against the tree line where the swamp pressed close. Inside, bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters like strange fruit, their shadows writhing in candlelight. "This here is foxglove," Ruth whispered, holding up delicate purple flowers that looked almost beautiful. "Pretty thing, ain't it? In small amounts it makes a weak heart strong. In larger amounts it makes any heart stop. But we ain't gonna stop nothing quick. Quick brings questions." Binta listened with an intensity that made Ruth pause. The girl who had stood in her cabin yesterday, broken and bleeding, was gone. In her place sat someone harder, colder, more focused than any 17-year-old should ever be. "White snake root," Ruth continued, moving to another bundle, "grows wild in the woods, causes something they call milk sick, makes you weak, makes you vomit, wastes you away slow, looks just like any other wasting disease. Abraham Lincoln's mama died from it, drank milk from a cow that ate this plant." "How long?" Binta's voice was steady. "How long what, child? How long would it take to kill a man with snake root?" Ruth studied her for a moment. "Months, maybe half a year if you're careful. Small amounts, steady. He'd just think he was sick. Doctors wouldn't know. They never know." "Good," Binta said. "Teach me everything." For 3 weeks, Binta learned. She learned which mushrooms caused liver failure that looked like alcohol poisoning. She learned how Jimson weed seeds caused confusion and hallucinations that could be mistaken for madness or fever. She learned about arsenic, the inheritance powder they called it. Too obvious, too traceable. She learned about lead poisoning from certain glazes, about mercury in old medicines, about dozens of plants that grew wild in Louisiana's forests and fields. But most importantly, she learned patience. "The hardest part ain't the doing," Ruth explained one night, grinding oleander leaves into powder. "The hardest part is watching, smiling, serving him his breakfast while you know what's coming. Can you do that? Can you look at him every day and not show what's in your heart?" Binta thought of that night. She thought of 5 faces, 5 men who had walked away to their ordinary lives while she bled and broke. "Yes," she said simply, "I can do anything." Meanwhile, life at Lancaster Hall continued its grotesque routine. Colonel Lancaster had indeed made Binta his personal servant, which meant she was never far from his sight. She brought his coffee at dawn, chicory and cream, the way he liked it. She drew his bath at noon. She served his dinner at 8. And twice a week he summoned her to his bedroom, where he repeated his violations with the casual cruelty of a man who had never faced consequences. Each time, Binta went somewhere else in her mind. She recited Ruth's lessons. Foxglove, 4 leaves in the morning coffee. Snake root, a pinch in the evening soup. Mercury, a drop in the bathwater. She built her revenge like a cathedral, 1 stone at a time, while Lancaster used her body like it was nothing. The other servants watched this transformation with awe and fear. Binta had become almost mechanical, perfectly obedient, never crying, never complaining. Only Ruth understood that this wasn't submission, this was preparation. "He's going to Philadelphia next month," Binta told Ruth one night. "Business with cotton brokers. He'll be gone for 3 weeks. "Good," Ruth said. "That gives us time to gather what we need. There's a patch of white snake root near Miller's Creek, and I know where oleander grows on the Beaumont place. We'll need both." "Why both?" "Because one might not be enough. Because his doctors might recognize 1 poison, but not 2 mixed together. Because we ain't taking chances, child. This man is gonna die, but it's gonna look natural as rain." On Lancaster's last night before his trip, he hosted another dinner, smaller this time, just a few local planters discussing the price of cotton and the trouble with uppity slaves on the Richmond plantation, who were whispering about freedom. Binta served them with downcast eyes and perfect posture, invisible the way servants were supposed to be. "Your girl is well trained, Frederick," commented Samuel Porter, whose own plantation was rumored to be the cruelest in the parish. "Mine could learn from her example." "Yes," Lancaster agreed, his hand briefly touching Binta's waist as she poured his wine, a casual violation that made the other men chuckle. "She understands her place now." Binta said nothing. She poured the wine with steady hands and thought about Foxglove, 4 leaves in the morning coffee. She had already begun practicing her measurements, using Ruth's dried samples to learn exactly how much was needed. Not enough to kill quickly, just enough to damage slowly, systematically, irreversibly. That night, after the guests had left and Lancaster had used her 1 final time before his trip, Binta lay in her small room and stared at the ceiling. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks he would return, and her real work would begin. Ruth had warned her, "Once you start, you can't stop. If you dose him irregular, he might recover. It's got to be steady every day for months. Can you commit to that? Can you commit to watching a man die slowly?" Binta had answered without hesitation, "I can watch him die forever." Now, in the darkness, she whispered the names like a prayer. Foxglove, snake root, oleander, mercury, the tools of her justice, growing wild in Louisiana soil, waiting to be harvested, waiting to kill. In Philadelphia, Colonel Lancaster would negotiate cotton prices and attend fancy dinners. He would boast about his profitable plantation and his well-ordered household. He would never suspect that back home, in the forests and fields of his own property, his death was being carefully gathered, measured, and prepared. When he returned, Binta would be waiting with her perfect smile and her downcast eyes. She would serve his coffee, she would draw his bath, she would play the part of the broken, obedient slave girl, and every single day she would poison him. Press the like button now if you felt anger, pain, or hope in this video. Colonel Frederick Lancaster returned from Philadelphia on a Tuesday in late September, when the heat still pressed down like a wet blanket, but the nights had begun to cool. He arrived in high spirits, his coach loaded with new furnishings and his pockets heavy with contracts. The Philadelphia cotton brokers had agreed to his prices. His fortune was secure. Binta greeted him at the door. With perfect posture and a tray bearing his favorite, chicory coffee with cream and 3 sugars. She had prepared it exactly as he liked it. She had also prepared it with 4 carefully crushed foxglove leaves, strained so finely that no trace of plant matter remained. Just the poison, invisible and patient. "Welcome home, Colonel," she said softly, her eyes appropriately lowered. Lancaster barely looked at her as he took the cup. He had already forgotten Philadelphia, his mind turning to plantation business, the cotton that needed picking, the levee that needed reinforcing before the river rose. He drank the coffee in 3 long swallows, handed her the empty cup, and strode toward his office. Binta returned to the kitchen where Ruth waited, pretending to polish silver. "It started," Binta whispered. Ruth nodded slowly. "No going back now, child. Remember, steady. Every morning, every evening. Don't miss a day. Don't show anything on your face." For the first week, nothing changed. Lancaster moved through his days with his usual brutal efficiency, riding out to inspect the fields, meeting with his overseers, entertaining dinner guests. He showed no signs of illness. Binta began to worry that Ruth's dosages were wrong, that the poison wasn't working. "Patience," Ruth counseled. "Plants don't work like bullets. They work slow, building up in the body like floodwater. Give it time." The second week brought the first signs. Lancaster complained of feeling tired, unusual for a man who typically rose at dawn, full of energy. He snapped at his overseer for minor mistakes. His appetite decreased slightly, not enough to raise alarm, but enough that Binta noticed him leaving food on his plate. The third week he vomited after dinner, just once, briefly. He blamed it on bad oysters from New Orleans and thought nothing more of it. But Binta smiled in the darkness of her room that night. It was working. She had established a careful routine. Morning, coffee, foxglove, 4 leaves worth, no more, no less. Evening soup, a pinch of ground white snake root mixed with the herbs the cook used for flavoring. Twice a week, when she drew his bath, she added 3 drops of mercury she had carefully extracted from an old barometer Ruth had stolen from an abandoned plantation house. The mercury was the most dangerous part. Too much too fast would cause obvious symptoms, but small amounts, absorbed through skin over months, would cause confusion, tremors, kidney failure, symptoms that looked like age, like natural decline. By October, Lancaster had lost weight, not dramatically. His clothes still fit, his face hadn't hollowed, but the difference was there. His cheekbones stood out more sharply. His collar sat looser on his neck. He complained of stomach pains to Dr. Morrison, who visited from New Orleans. Binta served them tea, while the doctor examined Lancaster in his bedroom. She kept her expression neutral, her movements efficient, invisible the way good servants were supposed to be. "You're working too hard, Frederick," Dr. Morrison pronounced after his examination. "The stress of plantation management, the Louisiana heat. It's affecting your digestion. I'll prescribe a tonic. Beef broth, plenty of rest. You'll be right as rain within a month." Lancaster agreed, relieved. A minor illness, nothing more. He began taking the doctor's tonic, a useless mixture of herbs and alcohol that did nothing to counter the poisons slowly destroying his body from within. Binta continued her routine without variation. 4 foxglove leaves in the morning coffee, a pinch of snake root in the evening soup, 3 drops of mercury in the bathwater. She had become a machine of revenge, steady and remorseless. But the hardest part wasn't the poisoning. The hardest part was what Lancaster still demanded of her body. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, he still summoned her to his bedroom. As his physical health declined, his violations became more desperate, more violent, as if he sensed something slipping away and needed to assert his power more forcefully. Binta endured these nights by counting the days since she had started, counting the symptoms she had observed, counting down to his death. "He's getting weaker," she told Ruth in November. "He can't ride as long. He gets out of breath climbing the stairs." "Good," Ruth said, grinding more snake root. "The foxglove is weakening his heart. The mercury is clouding his mind. The snake root is destroying his liver. Altogether, they look like wasting disease. Natural causes. No one will question it." But someone was beginning to notice patterns. Samuel Porter, Lancaster's neighbor and frequent dinner guest, commented one evening that Frederick looked unwell. "You've lost considerable weight, my friend," Porter said over brandy. "Perhaps you should travel. The air in Savannah is healthful this time of year. Or better yet, spend the winter in Charleston, away from these swamps." Lancaster laughed, though it sounded hollow. "Nonsense. It's just age, Samuel. We're not as young as we used to be." But privately, Lancaster was worried. The stomach pains had become constant. He had begun experiencing strange episodes, moments where his vision blurred, where his thoughts scattered like startled birds. He had trouble remembering conversations. His hands shook when he signed documents. Dr. Morrison was called again in December. This time, his examination was longer, more thorough. He listened to Lancaster's heart with his stethoscope, frowned at what he heard. He examined Lancaster's eyes, his tongue, his trembling hands. "Frederick, I'm concerned," the doctor said. "Your symptoms suggest several possibilities, none of them pleasant. It could be a cancer. It could be a disorder of the nervous system. It could be heart disease. I recommend you travel to Philadelphia, consult with specialists there." Lancaster refused. He was too proud, too stubborn, and perhaps some part of him suspected that leaving the plantation wouldn't help, that whatever was killing him wasn't tied to place but to something else, something he couldn't name. By Christmas, he was noticeably ill. The weight loss was dramatic now. He had dropped perhaps 30 pounds. His skin had taken on a greyish cast. His eyes sat deep in their sockets, haunted and confused. The tremors in his hands had spread to his whole body. He spent most days in his bedroom, emerging only for necessary business. But still, Binta brought his coffee every morning. Still, she served his soup every evening. Still, she drew his baths. And Lancaster, too sick and confused to make the connection, accepted these services with the entitled thoughtlessness of a man who had never questioned his right to be served. "How long now?" Binta asked Ruth one night in late December, as they stood in the old woman's cabin preparing more poison. Outside, rain fell cold and steady, drumming on the roof. Ruth studied the girl carefully. 6 months of patient poisoning had changed Binta. She had grown colder, harder, more focused. The softness that had once lived in her eyes was gone, burned away by focused hate. "Another 2 months," Ruth said. "Maybe 3. His heart is weak now. His liver is failing. The mercury is destroying his mind. He's dying, child. Slowly, like you wanted, but he's dying." Binta nodded. 2 more months of bringing morning coffee. 2 more months of evening soup. 2 more months of watching a monster waste away, one day at a time, one poison at a time, until nothing was left but a corpse in silk sheets. She could wait 2 more months. She had waited this long. Write "remembered" in the comments, so her name will never be forgotten. January brought cold that was unusual for Louisiana. Frost on the grass, ice in the water troughs, slaves in the quarters huddling around fires trying to stay warm. Inside Lancaster Hall, Colonel Frederick Lancaster was dying, though only 2. People knew the truth of it. Dr. Morrison visited twice a week now, his face growing more concerned with each examination. He had consulted with colleagues in New Orleans, sent letters to specialists in Philadelphia and Boston. No one could explain the constellation of symptoms, the wasting, the tremors, the confusion, the irregular heartbeat, the strange grey cast to the skin. "It's as if several diseases are attacking him at once," Morrison confided to Overseer Wallace one evening. "Not." Realizing Binta was within earshot, refilling their brandy glasses with steady hands. Heart failure, liver disease, nervous disorder, all simultaneous. "I've never seen anything quite like it." Wallace frowned. Could it be poison? Binta's heart stopped for one terrible moment, though her face remained perfectly neutral, her hands perfectly steady as she poured. Dr. Morrison shook his head. "I considered that, but who would have access? And the symptoms don't match any common poison. Arsenic works faster and causes different signs. Strychnine causes convulsions. This is something else, a wasting disease of unknown origin." Binta finished pouring and retreated to the kitchen, where she allowed herself one long, shaky breath. They had considered poison, but dismissed it. Ruth's combinations had done their work, too complex to identify, too slow to trace, too similar to natural illness to raise alarm. But the near miss made Binta realize something. She needed witnesses. She needed people who could testify that she had been the perfect, devoted servant, that Lancaster's death was natural, expected, unmysterious. So she began to perform grief. When Dr. Morrison visited, she asked quietly about the Colonel's condition, her voice trembling just slightly. "Is there anything that can be done, Doctor? Any medicine that might help?" Morrison, touched by what he perceived as genuine concern from a loyal servant, patted her hand. "You're a good girl, Binta. The Colonel is fortunate to have such devoted care. But no, I'm afraid there's nothing more to be done. We can only make him comfortable now." She asked the same of visitors: Samuel Porter, Judge Graves when he stopped by, various planters who came to discuss business. Each time she played her part perfectly. The concerned servant, devoted despite her bondage, worried for her master's health. They ate it up, these men who owned human beings. They loved the fiction of the loyal slave, the narrative that their peculiar institution was somehow benevolent. By February, Lancaster was confined to his bed. He couldn't walk without assistance. He couldn't feed himself. His mind drifted in and out of clarity. Sometimes he knew where he was, who he was. Other times he ranted about things that made no sense, seeing people who weren't there, reliving memories no one else could see. But Binta never missed a dose. Morning coffee, brought to his bedside now, held to his lips when his trembling hands couldn't grip the cup. Evening broth, he could no longer stomach solid food, enriched with snake root that his failing body couldn't process. Baths had stopped. He was too weak. But she wiped him down with cloths soaked in mercury-laced water, her face a mask of dutiful care, while inside she counted down the days. One night in late February, Lancaster had a moment of terrible clarity. Binta was wiping his face with a cool cloth when his hand suddenly shot out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, usually clouded and confused, focused sharply on her face. "You," he whispered, his voice rough. "What are you doing to me?" Binta's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression concerned, gentle, appropriate. "I'm caring for you, Colonel. You're ill." "No," he said, his grip tightening painfully. "No, there's something. I can feel it. You're... But the moment passed, his eyes unfocused. His hand fell away. He drifted back into confused delirium, muttering about cotton prices and Philadelphia and something about his mother from 50 years ago. Binta left the room on shaking legs and found Ruth in the kitchen. "He almost knew," she whispered. "Just for a moment. He almost knew." Ruth gripped her shoulders. "Almost don't matter. He's too far gone now. Even if he accused you, even if he told someone, who would believe him? A dying man, out of his mind with fever, accusing his devoted servant. They'd think it was delirium." She was right. The next day, when Lancaster raved to Dr. Morrison about poison, about betrayal, about Binta trying to kill him, the doctor simply increased his laudanum dosage and told Overseer Wallace that the end was near. "The mind goes first sometimes," Morrison explained. "He's seeing conspiracies where there are none. It's not uncommon in wasting diseases." By early March, Lancaster was barely conscious. He lay in his silk sheets, the same sheets that had been stained with Binta's blood 9 months earlier, and breathed in shallow, rattling gasps. The room smelled of death and laudanum. Dr. Morrison had given up pretending there was anything to be done. Now he simply kept Lancaster comfortable, or as comfortable as a dying man could be. Binta continued her vigil, bringing coffee he could no longer drink, broth he could barely swallow, but she never missed a dose. Every morning, every evening, the poisons went in. She had started this task, and she would finish it. Not because Lancaster could be saved, he was too far gone for that, but because she needed to know she had done it completely, thoroughly, without mercy. On March 7th, Samuel Porter visited one final time. He stood at Lancaster's bedside and shook his head sadly. "A great man," he said to Binta, who stood respectfully to the side. "A pillar of the community. It's a tragedy to see him brought low like this." Binta lowered her eyes and said what was expected. "Yes, sir, a tragedy." But inside, she was counting. Not the days until his death. That was close now. Maybe a week, maybe less. No, she was counting the others, the 5 men who had been there that night: Judge Graves in New Orleans, banker Ashworth in Natchez, plantation owners Dalton and Pierce, Captain James Lancaster sailing somewhere between ports. Frederick Lancaster was dying, but Binta's revenge had only just begun. That night, she asked Ruth to teach her about other poisons. Faster ones, more subtle ones, poisons that could be administered in different ways. Ruth studied her for a long moment. "The Colonel ain't enough for you, is he, child?" "No," Binta said simply. "He isn't." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then we'll need different plants, different methods. Some of those men you won't be able to reach easily. We'll have to be clever." "I have time," Binta said. "I have all the time in the world." Outside, frost covered the ground again, unusual for March. Inside Lancaster Hall, a dying man gasped his last breaths while his murderer wiped his face with gentle hands and thought about justice, not just for herself, but for every girl, every woman, every person who had suffered under men like these and had no other weapon but patience and poison. The legend of Binta was being born in that room, though no one knew it yet. Not the dying colonel, not the concerned doctor, not the neighboring planters who shook their heads at the tragedy. Only Ruth knew, and Ruth would take that knowledge to her grave. Comment history charged if you believe that the truth always comes back. Colonel Frederick Lancaster died at dawn on March 14, 1847, with Binta standing at his bedside, a cold cloth in her hand and no emotion on her face. Dr. Morrison, who had been sleeping in a guest room, was summoned immediately. He pronounced the death expected, natural, a mercy after such prolonged suffering. "Wasting disease," he wrote on the death certificate, his pen scratching across paper in the quiet of Lancaster's study. Etiology unknown, duration 6 months. The funeral was grand, as befitted a man of Lancaster's position. Planters came from 3 parishes. Judge Graves travelled from New Orleans, standing graveside in his black suit, speaking of Lancaster's contributions to the community. Banker Ashworth sent a wreath from Natchez with a card expressing his sorrow at the loss of such a valued client. The Dalton and Pierce families attended, their wives weeping appropriately, though they had barely known the deceased. Binta stood with the other house servants at a respectful distance from the white mourners, her head bowed, her face a mask of appropriate grief. She had dressed in her finest serving clothes, had arranged her hair in the neat style Mrs. Lancaster had once preferred. She looked exactly as she should, the devoted servant, mourning her master, accepting her uncertain future with quiet dignity. No one suspected. Not Dr. Morrison, who had attended Lancaster for months. Not Overseer Wallace, who now faced the complicated task of managing the plantation sale. Lancaster had no direct heirs, only distant cousins who would arrive from Virginia to claim the estate. Not Samuel Porter, who gave the eulogy and spoke movingly of his friend's character. Only Ruth knew, and when Binta's eyes met the old woman's across the cemetery, Ruth gave the smallest nod. It was done. 1 down. But as the mourners dispersed and life slowly returned to its brutal routine, Binta was already thinking ahead. Lancaster's death had satisfied something deep and primal in her, the need to see him pay, to watch him suffer, to know that she had been the instrument of his destruction. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough while 4 other men walked free. The problem was access. Lancaster had been easy. She had been his personal servant, had handled his food and drink daily, had been able to poison him slowly and thoroughly without suspicion. But Judge Graves lived in New Orleans, banker Ashworth in Natchez. The plantation owners had their own households, their own servants. Captain James Lancaster was at sea more often than not. Reaching them would require different methods, different approaches, and it would require freedom, something Binta did not have while she remained enslaved on Lancaster's estate, waiting to be sold to whatever cousin inherited the property. Ruth understood this better than anyone. One night, 3 weeks after the funeral, she called Binta to her cabin, with unusual urgency. "You need to run," Ruth said without preamble. "The cousins from Virginia will be here within a month. They'll sell off the slaves to settle the estate. You might end up in Mississippi or Texas or somewhere you can't reach the others. You need to run now while things are confused, while no one's watching. Careful." "Run where?" Binta asked. "The patrols." "I got connections," Ruth interrupted. "People who help runaways get north. It's dangerous, but possible. And once you're free, once you're in New York or Philadelphia or Canada, you can plan. You can figure out how to reach the others without risking your neck every day. You'll be punished if they know you helped me." Ruth smiled, a hard smile that held no warmth. "Child, I'm 63 years old. I've been enslaved for 58 of those years. I've seen more horror than you can imagine. If I can help one person get free, if I can help one person make evil men pay, then whatever they do to me is worth it." They planned carefully. The Underground Railroad had connections even in Louisiana, though they were sparse and dangerous. Ruth knew a free black woman in New Orleans who helped runaways, a seamstress named Marguerite, who had once been enslaved on a plantation near Lancaster's. She could get Binta onto a ship heading north, hidden in cargo, provided Binta could reach New Orleans without being caught. On April 3rd, while Overseer Wallace was in Baton Rouge meeting with Lancaster's Virginia cousins, Binta disappeared. She took nothing but the clothes on her back and a small package Ruth had given her. Dried plants, carefully labeled, wrapped in oilcloth, tools for her future work. The journey to New Orleans took 5 days of hiding, traveling at night, trusting strangers who risked everything to help her. She was caught twice, once by a patrol that accepted a bribe from a sympathetic farmer, once by a slave catcher she killed with a knife Ruth had given her. She left his body in a bayou and never looked back. Marguerite, the seamstress, hid her for 2 weeks in a room above her shop, fed her, taught her to read better, a skill Binta would need in freedom. Then she put Binta on a ship to Philadelphia, hidden in a false compartment built into the cargo hold, with forged papers identifying her as a free woman named Mary Washington. The voyage took 3 weeks. Binta spent them in darkness, studying the plants Ruth had given her by candlelight, planning, calculating, preparing for the long game ahead. She arrived in Philadelphia in May 1847, 2 months after Lancaster's death. The city was enormous, overwhelming. More people than she had ever imagined existed, more noise, more chaos, more possibility. She found work as a laundress, took a small room in a boarding house for black workers, and began to plan. If you also believe that stories like this need to be remembered, subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss anything. Judge Graves would be first. He was elderly, nearly 70, and according to newspapers, she read at the library. He suffered from gout and heart problems. That would make things easier. She learned that he attended the same cafe every morning for coffee, sitting in the same seat, reading his paper, accepting service from black waitstaff who were invisible to him. Getting hired at that cafe took 3 months of patient work, finding connections, proving she was reliable, demonstrating perfect deference. But by August, she was serving coffee to New Orleans' finest citizens, including Judge Milton Graves, who never once recognized the girl he had violated 2 years earlier. The foxglove grew just as well in the gardens of Philadelphia as it did in Louisiana, and Binta had learned her lessons well. This time, it took only 2 months. Judge Graves died in October, his death attributed to heart failure, a not unexpected end for a man of his age and condition. The New Orleans papers printed a respectful obituary. Binta read it in the boarding house library and felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief, no joy, just a cold sense of completion. 1 more down, 3 to go. Over the next 5 years, Binta hunted them systematically. Banker Thomas Ashworth died of a mysterious wasting illness in 1849, just as he was about to be appointed to a prestigious banking commission. Robert Dalton suffered a tragic accident in 1850, fell from his horse after the animal became Mr. Tentar novamente es continuar, piously spooked, broke his neck on impact. William Pierce lasted until, before a sudden onset of symptoms matching Lancaster's killed him over 6 agonizing months. Each death required careful planning. Each required Binta to transform herself, to gain access, to be invisible while being present. She worked as a laundress, a cook, a seamstress. Whatever job put her close to her targets. She learned to forge documents, to create new identities, to move through the world like smoke. Captain James Lancaster was the last and the hardest. He spent most of his time at sea, moving between ports, never staying long enough for slow poison to work. Binta tracked him for 2 years, learning his routes, his habits, his favorite ports of call. She finally caught him in Baltimore in 1853. He was staying at a hotel, celebrating a successful voyage. She got work in the hotel kitchen and prepared his meals for 3 weeks. But this time, she didn't use the slow method. This time, she used something Ruth had taught her about, but warned against. A massive dose of oleander mixed into his celebration dinner. Captain Lancaster died violently, painfully, in his hotel room, vomiting blood and convulsing. The death was ruled as acute poisoning from bad seafood. Several other guests had reported illness from the oysters that night, though none as severe. Binta had been clever, contaminating the entire oyster delivery just enough to sicken others, making his death seem like tragic bad luck rather than murder. When she read of his death in the Baltimore papers, Binta felt the weight she had carried for 6 years finally lift. They were all dead, all 5 men who had violated her that night, plus the colonel who had orchestrated it. 6 monsters, eliminated from the world through patience, planning, and poison. She was 23 years old. She had spent 6 years becoming a murderer, and now she had to decide what to do with the rest of her life. Binta stayed in Baltimore for a while, working honestly as a seamstress, saving money, trying to feel like a person rather than an instrument of revenge. But she found that justice had become her purpose, her calling, her identity. Word spread in quiet ways, through networks of free black communities, whispered stories of a woman who helped when legal justice was impossible, a woman who could make problems disappear, a woman who knew plants and poisons and patience. She never advertised, she never sought clients, but they found her anyway. Women whose husbands beat them, families whose members had been kidnapped by slave catchers, communities terrorized by violent men who the law would never touch. And sometimes, just sometimes, Binta helped. Not always with poison. She had other skills now, other methods. But when necessary, when justice demanded it, she remembered Ruth's lessons. She remembered that plants grew everywhere, that patience was a weapon, that invisible people could do invisible things. The legend grew over decades. In some versions, she was a ghost, a spirit of vengeance, haunting those who harmed the powerless. In others, she was an angel, a protector sent by God to balance the scales. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She was a woman who had been broken and had chosen to become dangerous rather than defeated. Binta lived to be 67 years old, dying peacefully in 1897 in a small house in Philadelphia, surrounded by people she had helped over the years. The Civil War had come and gone. Slavery had ended. The world had changed in ways she never could have imagined that night in Lancaster Hall. But some things never changed. Powerful men still hurt powerless people. Legal justice still failed more often than it succeeded. And sometimes, just sometimes, quiet women with knowledge of plants made sure that monsters didn't die peacefully in their beds. They found Ruth's journal in Binta's belongings after she died. Pages and pages of plant descriptions, poison recipes, careful notes about dosages and symptoms. Her friends burned it, immediately understanding that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. But the stories remained. Passed down through families, whispered in communities, transformed over time into legend. The story of the girl who turned her master's table into his grave. The story of patience as a weapon. The story of how the powerless could still make power pay. In Louisiana, there's still a legend about Lancaster Hall, long since burned down. Nothing left but foundations and ghost stories. They say that, on certain nights, you can smell foxglove and oleander growing where the gardens used to be. They say that sometimes, in the pre-dawn darkness, you can see a young woman standing at the edge of the property, watching, waiting, counting days that have already passed. The historians dismiss these stories as folklore, as dramatic embellishments of a more mundane truth. They'll tell you that Colonel Lancaster died of natural causes, that Judge Graves succumbed to heart disease, that the others died in accidents or illness that had nothing to do with a slave girl's revenge. But in the communities that remember, in the families that still pass down these stories, they know differently. They know that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms or laws. They know that sometimes it comes slowly, mixed into morning coffee, served with a smile by someone who looks powerless but isn't. They know that Binta was real, that her revenge was real, that for 6 years she hunted men who thought themselves untouchable and proved them wrong, one poison at a time. And they know that her story matters, not because revenge is always right, not because murder is justified, but because it reminds us that even in the darkest systems, even in the most brutal oppressions, human beings refuse to be only victims. They fight back with whatever weapons they have, even if those weapons are foxglove and patience and a smile that hides everything. The legend of Binta is a ghost story and a horror story, and a justice story all at once. It's the story of what happens when you give someone nothing to lose. It's the story of how long hate can burn when it's carefully tended. It's the story of the prices that monsters eventually pay, even when the law protects them. Let this be recorded. Those who were silenced never stopped seeing, never stopped remembering, never gave up waiting for the right weight of justice. And when the time comes, you know exactly where to pick it up. And if you think you've seen the worst, wait until you see what's here on the screen. It's a story that will move you. I'll be waiting for you there.